A girl disappeared from her home under strange circumstances. What happened next was more like a bizarre movie plot than a real-life case. It was difficult to believe what had happened because such a combination of events is extremely unusual. 15 years later, you witness the unexpected, and discovering the truth only makes matters worse. Jessica Dyson was born on May 2, 1982, in the small American town of Shapersville, Kentucky. It was a quiet and peaceful community in which the majority of residents farmed and knew one another. Jessica had 2 younger brothers to look after. She had to care for them from a young age while her parents were at work, so the girl was very independent, and Mom and Dad could always rely on her. When she was 15, she worked part-time at a local restaurant to save money for her first car. She wanted a red Pontiac, and after a few years, she had saved enough money to purchase one. Despite working part-time, Jessica had time to study and planned to attend college to study accounting in the fall of 1999 when she was 17. Jessica left during her senior year. The girl also began dating a friend and was very excited about the relationship. Friday morning, September 10th, started as usual. Jessica's parents drove her to work while she was still sleeping. Then her younger brothers went to the bus stop and boarded the school bus. The girl stayed at home alone and had to drive to school in her car. Her mother arrived home at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and immediately noticed something strange. Jessica, who should have been in class, had her car parked in front of the house. She entered the house and proceeded to her daughter's room. Her first thought was that Jessica hadn't heard the alarm clock and might have overslept at school. However, she was not in the bedroom. She then wondered if her daughter had asked her father to take her to school for some reason. She called her husband, but he replied that he had gone to work alone that morning. Jessica's mother assumed there was a problem with her car and took the spare key from home to try to start it. However, as the car approached, she noticed a very disturbing sight. The driver's door was slightly open, and her daughter's cell phone was on the seat. Jessica entered 2 numbers into the display. Jessica's sneakers and car keys were under the seat, while her school books, work clothes, and handbag were on top of the back seat. The woman immediately assumed the worst. It was almost obvious that she had attempted to enter the emergency number into her cell phone, but she had not had enough time. Besides, Jessica couldn't have left all of her belongings in the car and walked somewhere. She lived on the outskirts of the city, so she would have had to walk several kilometers down the road. The parents called the school and were informed that the girl had not shown up for class. According to school regulations, the school should have contacted and informed the relatives much earlier, but for whatever reason, they did not. A few hours later, Jessica's parents received a call from her best friend, with whom she had worked at the restaurant. She stated that the girl did not show up for her shift, which worried her even more. The parents then decided to contact the police and drive to the office. The sheriff said their daughter had missed school and work and had left all of her belongings in the unlocked car, including a cell phone with the numbers 9 and 1 dialed. However, she was about to face another problem. The sheriff explained that the girl had probably just gone somewhere and would return home sooner or later, so he advised them to wait until the next day. He also didn't let himself be irritated by the fact that there was only 1 sneaker left in the car, without which the girl could barely get anywhere. Jessica's parents were furious and attempted to persuade the sheriff that their daughter could be in danger. However, the police officer refused to respond, so they were forced to return home. Eventually, the parents had to take the initiative and call all of their relatives, acquaintances, and friends. But no one saw Jessica. They drove through the city together, but they were unable to locate the girl. The parents returned to the sheriff the next day complaining that their daughter had yet to return. This time, the sheriff dispatched 2 officers to the house to investigate Jessica's car. But there was another issue. The officers were very unprofessional. They inspected the car without gloves. They then drove away without taking anything with them or even looking into the girl's room, as is required by all regulations. The parents needed to get their money's worth again. They contacted the local media and reported on their daughter's disappearance, as well as the fact that the police showed no interest in the case. They launched their own search with the help of relatives and friends, as well as printing out numerous leaflets with information about the missing girl. Jessica's father and brother, Stanley, carried out the search. They knew each other well in the area and were attempting to determine where the girl was most likely to be found. At this point, they feared Jessica had died, so the brothers suggested searching the area near the local river. It had a bad reputation among locals due to its overgrowth and inaccessibility. Various criminal acts occurred frequently there, ranging from the sale and consumption of illegal substances to murder. The girl's relatives searched the area for several hours, but discovered nothing. The next day, something strange occurred. Jessica's parents were at home while her son was playing in the garden. He ran into the house and claimed to have heard a scream. He assumed it was Jessica's voice. The girl's father grabbed his gun and dashed outside to see where the scream came from. He summoned his brother to the house, who quickly joined him. They soon noticed smoke rising from their neighbor, 40-year-old David Brooks' property. As they got closer, they noticed that the man was burning something on his property that resembled clothing. That seemed suspicious to them, so Jessica's father asked Brooks for permission to look around his property. But the man refused, insisting that they leave. Prior to these events, the missing girl's relatives noticed something strange. They had normal relationships with Brooks and his family. Almost immediately after Jessica disappeared, he began acting strangely. The man began to drive past your house at a slow speed, watching them and smiling. Then Jessica's parents received strange phone calls in which an unknown man remained silent and breathed into the receiver. They believed Brooks was doing this, but they couldn't explain why. After he burned some clothes on his property, Jessica's parents decided to contact the police again, who had still not joined the search. They explained the situation, and the officers arrived at Brooks' house with search dogs. They took Jessica's belongings to sniff and examine the ashes of the fire, but no useful evidence was discovered. The dogs also discovered black gloves in one of the sheds. They detected a corpse odor. Brooks had been acting strangely the entire time, and when the officers approached the ashes, his suspicious behavior increased significantly. However, because the police officers saw no direct connection to Jessica's disappearance, she was once again unable to produce any evidence. Jessica's parents were again dissatisfied with the police's actions, so her father decided to contact the FBI. Even though the FBI usually does not begin investigating cases after receiving a call from relatives of missing people, it decided to get involved right away. After hearing all of the disturbing facts, the girl's parents concluded that something terrible had happened to her. At this point, the actual investigation began, which the police denied. The FBI agents collected fingerprints from Jessica's room and car and transported all possible evidence to a laboratory for examination. At the same time, the investigators conducted a thorough search of the area with the assistance of helicopters and volunteers. The bottom of a pond near the girl's house was also thoroughly searched to see if it contained her belongings. The FBI agents also thoroughly searched the Brooks farm, and they discovered something very disturbing in one of the barns. There was a printed photograph of Jessica. After that, the investigators had little doubt that Brooks was involved in the case, and they suspected that his 3-year-old brother Joseph was as well, given his strange behavior. However, they encountered a problem during their search. The investigators discovered no evidence that would have allowed them to arrest the brothers, so they focused solely on the search. On September 27th, 17 days after Jessica disappeared, the police received a call in which it was almost certain that the girl had died. A woman was driving down the road near the river where the girl's father and friends had been looking for her in the first few days. When she drove past a tree a few dozen meters from the road, she noticed something strange and came to a stop. When the woman approached the tree, she noticed something that resembled a human body and immediately called the police. FBI agents arrived at the crime scene and discovered a dead girl there. Her legs lacked several fingers and limbs. There was a rope with traces of red and silver paint. Several of her clothes were missing. The degree of decomposition led the investigators to conclude that the perpetrator had abused her. They couldn't visually confirm Jessica's identity, so they dispatched officers to her home and asked her parents for assistance. The girl's father couldn't bear to look at his dead daughter, but the mother agreed. When she arrived, she wasn't sure if it was Jessica based on the face, but she immediately noticed a small butterfly tattoo on her body. It was identical to that of her daughter. The forensic pathologists confirmed the deceased's identity and determined that the cause of death was strangulation. They discovered numerous abrasions on her body. In addition, the experts discovered that her limbs and fingers had been severed from her body after she died. Another fact was devastating to Jessica's parents. It turned out that she had been alive for about 3 days after her disappearance. However, the police did have a real chance of saving her. They did not take any action in this direction. After discovering the body, the FBI agents decided to question Brooks again, and they learned that something interesting awaited them. During their first conversation, the man stated that he had seen Jessica the morning she disappeared. He was seen near her house, but he later changed his story, claiming he did not see her that day. Instead, investigators said he was at home in bed with his wife. However, when they interviewed her, she denied her husband's claims. The FBI agents then asked him what he would have done if they had discovered his fingerprints on the victim's body. Nothing of the kind was discovered, but Brooks's response appeared as suspicious as possible. He stated that in this situation, he would have had to confess everything. He later failed a lie detector test, prompting the FBI to take the case to trial. They realized their chances of a conviction were slim because they couldn't find any direct evidence linking Brooks to it. All they had were a few disturbing but highly indirect indications of his involvement, so they continued to work on the case and look for more evidence. While preparing for the trial, investigators remembered another intriguing detail about the search for Brooks. In the car, she discovered a rope that was very similar to the one used to tie the victim's legs, but no DNA print was found. Thus, this evidence was classified as circumstantial. The trial didn't start until January 2, 2003. Brooks' defense attorney clung. The investigators also discovered some of the victim's missing limbs, placed them in special containers, and turned them over to local police. For some reason, they ignored the large "keep in the fridge" signs and left the containers at room temperature, resulting in nearly complete decomposition. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to remind you that if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please do so now and like the video so that I can have the energy to publish new videos. Thank you. Even if some evidence could have been obtained from them, including possible traces of the murderer, it all vanished due to an error. All of the other evidence pointing to Brooks's guilt was insufficient, and the jury ultimately failed to reach a verdict. As a result, he was released on bail. Following that, under state law, he could only be charged again with the crime if new evidence was discovered. This was a severe blow to Jessica's parents. They had little doubt that Brooks was behind her murder, and her daughter could have been saved if the police had taken their work seriously. Finally, they gave up hope that they would receive justice. The case dragged on for several years before it was finally resolved. This continued until 2012, when Lynn Hunt, a new detective, was hired at the local office. She was assigned to reopen old unsolved cases, and the first thing she did was devote her full attention to Jessica's murder after reviewing the files. If she had familiarized herself, she would have been shocked by her predecessor's lack of professionalism. Almost every document was filled out incorrectly. Conversations with the participants were not mentioned. The evidence was not correctly formalized. In other words, everything was so useless that she had to restart the investigation 13 years after the murder. She spoke first with the girl's relatives. One of her brothers, now an adult, lived independently of his parents. He handed her a box containing Jessica's belongings from her car, which he had kept since the police returned the family's belongings. He was once again surprised that her colleagues had handled the evidence so carelessly and had not properly stored it. Now, after all these years, none of these items have been able to shed any light on the situation. However, she continued to examine everything she could find, and she soon discovered an intriguing detail among the documents. Brooks' medical examination report showed that the man's EQ was only 61 points, which was considered extremely low. This called into question all police measures, including the interrogation of Brooks. At this level of intelligence, he could have answered the majority of the questions posed to him, but he may not have done so in the most sensible manner. All of this led her to believe that the man had nothing to do with the case, as his strange behavior could be explained by his extremely low IQ. Then she started to wonder who else could have done the murder. She spent a significant amount of time investigating everyone involved in the case or who lived nearby. This continued until September 2014, nearly exactly 15 years after Jessica's death. The detective received a call from a colleague from another legal authority. He reported receiving an interesting tip in a Kentucky state prison. One of the inmates claimed to know who murdered Jessica Dutchin and viewed this tip with skepticism. When inmates attempted to provide information to the police, it typically resulted in frustration and a waste of time. The majority of them made up stories to get into parole or better conditions. However, she realized she couldn't avoid verifying this information. She went to prison and met a man who claimed to be the one. According to his statement, he previously shared a cell with a man convicted of molesting minors, the same offense for which he had previously been imprisoned. On this basis, the perverts became friends and exchanged information about the crimes they had committed. One day, a cellmate informed him that he had been killed. Among others, Jessica Dostian. The informant then told the detective the man's name, which shocked the woman. It was Stanley Dutchin, Jessica's maternal uncle and father's brother. According to the informant, Stanley told him that he had abused the girl as a child for several years while living in her home and threatened to kill her or someone close to her if she revealed what was happening. When Jessica met a friend in the spring of 1999, Stanley became concerned that she would tell him, sooner or later, about what her own uncle did to her. On the morning of September 10th, Stanley arrived at her house while the girl was alone. She was about to get into her car and had already thrown everything in when he approached her and demanded that she end her relationship with this man right away. Jessica refused to listen and threatened to inform him of his abuse if he did not tell her. Leaving her alone, he began to threaten her, prompting the girl to pick up the phone and call 911. Stanley then attempted to grab her, but Jessica managed to free herself and ran into the house. The man followed her to her room. He beat her and wrapped her in her bedsheet before transporting her to an abandoned shed near where her body was later discovered. Stanley held her captive there for several days, abusing her before killing her, dragging her body outside to be discovered, and burying her in a sheet on the floor beneath the shed. He also admitted that, after the murder, he removed some of the victim's limbs to trick the cops into thinking they were drug dealers. Detective H stated that this information was never passed on. Only the girl's next of kin knew she was missing limbs, so the informant could not have made it up. Finally, he mentioned that Stanley had buried Jessica's sneaker beneath a broken tree near the shed. H decided to investigate all of the buried evidence right away because the local police department was understaffed. No one could help her in this situation. So she turned to Jessica's brother and a few other relatives, who agreed to assist in the search. The woman did not tell them that Stanley could be the murderer because she needed to confirm the shocking allegations. They found no clues on the first day of their search. In the pouring rain, they dug in locations that matched the informant's description, but they were unsuccessful. The next day, Jessica's brother and Hand drove there again, and the man directed the detective to an abandoned shed. They drove there and began digging in the ground, and almost immediately they made a happy discovery. They discovered a buried sheet and immediately rushed to Jessica's house. Her parents hadn't changed anything in her room in all these years. It was exactly as it had been the day her daughter went missing. The detective quickly determined that the linen found belonged to Jessica's bedding. It was missing from the bed, and the rest of the bedding featured the same pattern. Stanley was then arrested and taken in for questioning. The man refused to admit his crimes, but he was visibly shaken during the interview with the investigators. He eventually got arrested. The case was taken to court. Jessica's father could not believe what his brother had done to his daughter. He denied it for a long time, but eventually he came to accept this unbearable fact. The man recalled Stanley suggesting he look for the body near the river in the early days of the disappearance. But then, during the search, he became ill and brought his brother home. This occurred just a few hundred meters from the shed where the girl was lying. Apparently, Stanley misled them in this way, preventing them from discovering the girl was still alive. In preparation for the trial, Detective Hun conducted additional research into the suspect's background to uncover additional clues. She was already aware that he was in prison for abusing another girl in his family. However, something else quickly became apparent. Several other women who were close to Stanley reported to the police that he had abused her when she was younger. The incidents all had the same pattern. The man went to see his relatives because he didn't have his own home at the time. When he was alone with the girls, the pervert committed his dirty deeds and used threats to silence them. Based on all of these stories, the police concluded that Stanley had been doing this for 3 decades. Despite this, Detective H realized that obtaining a murder conviction would be difficult due to the lack of direct evidence against Stanley, such as fingerprints or DNA. So she kept digging through the case until she came across a box of papers she hadn't yet looked through. When she examined the contents, she was once again struck by the mediocrity of her predecessors, who had handled the case in its early years. The box contained a letter dated June 26, 2002. Another police informant wrote the same thing, which Hand learned 12 years later from an inmate in a Kentucky prison. Stanley was already imprisoned for abusing a minor relative by the summer of 2002. At the time, he introduced himself to his cellmate as Jessica. The entire cell, which also refused to cooperate with the police, sent a letter to the police department in charge of the case, detailing everything Stanley had done to his niece, as well as how and what they believed the police did. They just ignored the letter. Apparently, they were so convinced that Brooks was involved that they didn't even consider other suspects. H was dissatisfied with the behavior of their colleagues. After all, without their errors, the case could have been resolved in 2002. But now, after all these years, she could only wait for the trial and hope that the man would be punished for his actions. The trial began in 2015, and Stanley pleaded not guilty. Jessica's parents, who were present, couldn't take their gaze away from their relative, who had ruined her life. They were also upset with his inability to alleviate her suffering and admit what he had done. The prosecution was aware that the chances of a murder conviction were slim, given the cases of abuse of the other female relatives. So there was a problem here, too. Each of them would have to face the jury and explain in detail what Stanley had done to them, while his lawyer attempted to portray them as liars. Following careful consideration, the man was offered a deal. The prosecutors offered to waive the death penalty if Stanley admitted to the abuse of female relatives and the negligent homicide of Jessica. The man eventually agreed and pleaded guilty according to the terms of the agreement. To the victim's parents' dismay, he refused to reveal any information about his actions. They wanted Stanley to tell the whole truth, but he remained silent. According to the agreement, the murderer will serve 20 years in prison and will be eligible for parole after 15 years. Stanley, who was 56 years old when he was sentenced, could be released at the age of 71. Jessica's father later stated that if his brother did not die in prison, he would wait until his release to punish himself. Stanley was interviewed for the first time in 2019, and he denied killing Jessica. He claimed to have been at work that morning, but after 2 decades, this could not be confirmed. He also couldn't explain how 2 informants who didn't know each other could come up with identical stories based on facts that could only have been known by the murderer, David. Investigators have yet to rule out Brooks' involvement in the case. Stanley knew him and may have asked for his assistance in disposing of the victim's belongings and body. Given Brooks's low intelligence level, he may not have realized the gravity of the situation. It's possible that the girl's clothes and gloves, on which the dogs detected the corpse rays, were burned in the fire because Stanley gave them to him. Perhaps he stored Jessica's photograph in his shed to frame the man. However, we do not know if it is true. Brooks died from heart problems in 2021. We also want to remember when, on the third day of Jessica's disappearance, her younger brother heard a cry for help in front of the house and assumed it was his sister. We can't say exactly what it was. She should have been alive at that time. However, Stanley had kept her in a shed a few miles from their home. It's possible that the child only heard it because of the stress or that someone else was screaming. However, there is a more unlikely version. Stanley drove towards the house right after Jessica's father ran outside, indicating that he was nearby. We could assume that the girl was either unconscious or had her mouth taped. However, this theory appears unlikely. Thank you for staying with me until the end of the video. Subscribe to this channel. See you soon.